because they had a small number of submarines which could do 15 knots on the surface, about 5 knots submerged. British merchant ships were very numerous, but by present-day standards, they were really quite tiny. And they were doing 7 or 8 knots. And in November of 1917, something like 240 merchant ships were sunk in 1 month. The ships weren't sailing in convoy, and there was only 30 days of food left in Britain. So it looked as if Germany was going to win the war. And the submarine commanders had an extra advantage. Those circles are what called choke points. And let's see if we can get this to work. That one there, for instance, is ships coming from South America. I thought we got a little red thing. Let's try it. That's better. This is ships coming from South America, round the northwest of Ireland, round the Mulligan Tower to the Clyde. So the German submarines just had to lurk here, and they had absolutely no problem looking for targets. And the best the Royal Navy could do at the time was produce destroyers. And of course a lot of them were built on the Clyde, and particularly Dumbarton, which Denny's of Dumbarton could not produce big ships, but they were destroyer specialists. And if you look at the street names in Dumbarton, some of them are the same as famous destroyers. But the problems, let's see how we go here. The problems is they needed a big crew, and a lot of the crew were very skilled. And you can't, for instance, instruct and train a Royal Navy ship's engineer in a couple of weeks. And worst of all, they took a whole year to build. So what was needed was an alternative defense weapon. And the answer was an F-3 flying boat. They were crude by present-day standards, but actually they were quite good. The speed, of course, was limited to the engine power, but the great thing is it didn't take long to build them, and they only needed 4 people. And apart from the pilot, the other people spent most of their time looking for submarine periscopes, and it wasn't a very difficult job. So Beardmores of Dalmuir were shipbuilders, warship builders, but they started building war planes. And in fact, they were rather good at it. A bunch of girls built a fighter aeroplane in 1 working day. I once set up a factory to make sails, and we never employed anybody but girls, and they always turned up on time, and they never turned up hungover. And I'm bound to say that I'm not surprised that a bunch of girls could build a fighter in 1 working day. And if you are a shareholder in BAE Systems, I think you should write to the chairman and ask why they take so long to build fighters these days. Beardmores actually is where the anniversary hospital now is, and they rather cheated because they were building every kind of aeroplane, bombers, fighters and reconnaissance, and they couldn't find facilities to build flying boats, even though they had a contract. So they farmed the work out to 3 yacht builders: Robertson's Sandbank, Bute Slip Dock, run by Charles and Alfred Milne the first, famous designer, and Fyffes of Fairley. And these were all family companies. And of course they were very skilled at building accurate wood structures, because they built international 6 meters, international 8 meters, international 12 meters, and so on. And they were building to the nearest 1/8 of an inch, or as we have to say in Napoleon speak, to the nearest 3 millimeters. So these 3 companies suddenly found themselves A, very prosperous, and B, very popular. And, God willing, that is an F-3 flying boat fuselage at Bute Slip Dock in 1917. I know the photograph's not as good as Clive normally takes it, but in 1917, photography was not quite up to the present standard. And these were quite sophisticated planes in many ways. They had machine guns and bombs and all that sort of thing. And you can't subcontract flying boat builders, or indeed anything for that matter, without somebody to supervise the work, somebody to inspect progress, and somebody to sign the things off. And by great good luck, there was a chap called David who was at Glasgow University in 1914 when the First World War broke out, and he joined as a second lieutenant. The local regiment, Highland Light Infantry, based on Mary Hill Road, Glasgow, and was very soon in the trenches as a second lieutenant, and in no time at all the lieutenants were all killed, so he became a lieutenant. Then the captains were all killed, so he became a captain. Then he was a major, then he was an acting lieutenant colonel in under 3 years, and that's the First World War for you. And incidentally, half the members of the Clyde Cruising Club, half the members in 1914 were killed in the next 4 years, and I think that's a unique figure for any yacht club. Right, so we have David, who is visiting these 3 boatyards around the Clyde. Now, I've tried to get a First World War picture looking up Holy Loch, Loch Long, Cardwell Bay. But that is, I would guess, any time after 1940 on the Clyde. And the First World War would be similar, but of course the ships would be a good deal smaller. That's an ocean-going transatlantic liner. That's a much more typical ship of 1914 to 18. And one of David's problems was that he lived in Glasgow and he had to get down to these boatyards, and there was a submarine net across the Clyde. This again is a Second World War picture, but it was the same in the First World War. This is the Clock Lighthouse, this is Dunoon, and that of course is up the Clyde, and this is down towards the open sea. And one of David's problems was that he would leave home in the morning to go to the yacht yards to see how progress was getting. One of the jobs he had to do was to make sure that these very accurate measurements were precise, because the fuselages were made in one boatyard very often, and the wings in another boatyard, and if they didn't match, that was really rather bad news. So they were working to the nearest eighth of an inch. And David, who did a shipwright apprentice and naval architect apprentice before going to university, he knew how to measure up marine structures. But this anti-submarine double net has a gateway, and this trawler opens the gate to let ships through. And they stopped at dark because they reckoned that after dark a ship coming through could be followed by a submarine close behind, and that way a submarine would get into this area, and that would be a wolf among the sheep in every sense of the word. So David couldn't always get home at night, but fortunately he could get to the Royal Clyde, which I think is about there. And so he joined the Royal Clyde yacht. Well, he didn't actually join because he was in the army, so he didn't need to join. It's one of the nicer things about the 2 world wars, that all the yacht clubs with clubhouses opened their doors, in every sense of the word, to serving officers. After the war ended, David stayed with the Ministry of Aircraft Production for a number of years, and in 1923 he was headhunted and he joined a firm called Saunders Row in Cowes. Saunders Row was run by a bunch of schoolboys, adult schoolboys, and they were thrilled to play with anything that went fast, and if it was dangerous, all the more fun. and nominally they were supposed to build motorboats and world record racing, powercraft, and flying boats. One of the early clients David dealt with was called, having a senior moment, Betty Carstairs. If Betty Carstairs was alive in Britain now, she would certainly be well up the list of the most wealthy people in Britain. She got her money from Dad. Dad founded the Esso Petroleum Company. She counted her thousands the way you and I count our pennies. And she came up with the idea of winning the Blue Ribbon. The Blue Ribbon's quite an old trophy, and it was intended for ocean liners crossing the Atlantic. And the one that crossed the Atlantic with a load of passengers fastest won the Blue Ribbon. But the people who drew up the deed of gift were a bit sloppy, and they said something like crossing the Atlantic as a passenger vessel. And Betty Carstairs thought, well, that's fine. I'll find somebody who wants a bit of excitement. I'll charge them $10, and they will be the crew of the Jack Stripes, which I will order from Saunders Row, and we will nip across the Atlantic at about 60 miles an hour in good weather, but really rather a lot less in bad weather, and we will get the Blue Ribbon. And in these days, the Blue Ribbon was front page news on all the newspapers. There wasn't any television, and yes, there wasn't any television until 1937. I claim to be one of the few people alive who actually saw it in 1937. And after I saw television, we were driving home, and my mother said, "What did you think about it?" Well, I was 9 at the time, and I said I didn't think much of those middle-aged women prancing around, and these were 20-year-old dancing girls. Going back to Jack Stripes, 4 engines. A lot of Saunders Row craft had aero engines, and Napier built aero engines. Now, an aeroplane engine is out in the fresh air, and the aeroplane is typically doing 100 miles an hour. So the cooling is really rather effective, because a great deal of fresh air is blasting past the engine and keeping it cool. In Jack Stripes, there were 4 Napier engines enclosed, and Saunders Row, the designers and builders, they knew they would overheat, so they came up with a cunning plan. They designed the thing to do about 60 miles an hour with 2 Napier engines, and after about 2 hours running, these engines would overheat, and they would be stopped, and the other 2 would be started. And then when they overheated, you go back to the first lot. And of course, one of the advantages of having 4 engines in the stern of this thing is that if you had quite a lot of breakdowns, so these engines were highly stressed, you could cannibalize them, and hopefully they would all work out okay. But it was not dangerous, it was stupid dangerous. The Jack Stripes needed probably 4 and maybe 5 and possibly 6 refueling points in the middle of the Atlantic. Now, no GPS. The only way you could be sure where you are is to take a sight with a sextant. I don't know whether any of you use sextants these days. I've sold mine, much to my regret, because it was really rather fun. You can't use a sextant at 60 miles an hour bouncing around in a high-speed motorboat. So you'd have to stop and take a sight. And you need the sun or the moon or the stars. Well, of course, the transatlantic trip was going to have a lot of weather. And okay, maybe not quite as rainy as Scotland, but the Saunders Row directors talked Betty Carstairs out of doing it, having sold her a really rather expensive boat with a lot of expensive engines. And I've always thought, what was the board meeting like before they met to start talking Betty out of doing the transatlantic race? She actually didn't seem to mind, and she went on to win a lot of races. That's a wee bit of a diversion. David's real interest in the firm was flying boats. And very early on, he came across once again the great problem with flying boats landing in heavy weather. There's no brake on a flying boat. The way it slows down and stops is the resistance of the water on the sea or the river if you're landing on a river. And if it's rough, it's all rather discontinuous, and it's a very severe force. I mean, this thing weighs, 40, 50, 60 tons, but the engines are a lot of the weight, and the engines have to be high up because they're aero engines. They hate salt spray. Salt spray corrodes them and seizes things up inside. So the engines have to be very high. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to see. If you put lots of weight high up and lots of resistance low down, that's what happens. And David was really worried about this. And on one occasion, he was out in the company launch with a coxswain and nobody else, and they were watching a very small flying boat coming in, built of wood, because they built of wood and metal. They were pioneers in metal building of flying boats. And there was only one person on board, the pilot. And the flying boat went tail over top as it hit the water. So the coxswain raced the launch alongside the upside down flying boat, and there was a big fire axe in the launch. And David, having spent 3 years in the trenches in the First World War, knew what to do in an emergency, and he started bashing a hole in the bottom of the flying boat. The trouble was that these flying boats were designed to land in rough weather. So the bottom was very flexy. It was multiple layers of thin planks clenched together with copper. They actually followed the best boat building practice. Quite soon, David had a nice hole in the bottom, and he looked down the hole, and the pilot's head was just below the hole. But fortunately, far enough below the hole that he hadn't been dented by the axe. So David enlarged the hole, and he and the coxswain hauled the pilot out and took him home and dried him out. And the test pilots were pretty brave. He'd be up the next day in another plane, or what's worse, a sister ship of this wreck. The trouble with the flying boats is that 1/6 of the total takeoff weight was fuel, and they would do about 3 hours at about 100 miles an hour, but you couldn't fly until the tanks were empty. So they were built in Cowes in the Isle of Wight. If one of them was wanted on the Clyde or the Firth of Forth, they had to refuel halfway up the length of Britain. Well, part of the problem was the trains were really rather good in these days. The trains were doing about 90 miles an hour, and it looked bad if the flying boats took off, landed here, and then they were refueled. Refueling was primitive. The flying boat was anchored. I'm sorry, you can't get the help these days, can you? The draftsman's forgot to put the mooring and the float buoy and so on. But this flying boat is moored up. Launch comes alongside, full of petrol cans, which have to be passed up to the chap up here, and he fills the fuel tanks which are here. But of course, if it's raining, the fuel joins quite a lot of rain here. And if you're out in Singapore or somewhere, you've got various other hazards in the water. And Davy thought, this is a load of nonsense. We've got these gorgeous flying boats, and they've got this very short range, and we've got the world at our feet, because as he and all the other directors realized, the capital city of so many countries, particularly important countries, the capital cities are on rivers or on the sea or on lakes. Berlin, for instance, surrounded by lakes. There's the Thames through London. There's the Seine through Paris. Nobody counts Washington. Anyhow, that's on the Potomac, isn't it? New York is on the Hudson. If we can only coax people to buy flying boats, we're going to make a shitload of money. Shipload of money. But we've got to do something about this short range. And the answer is refueling in mid-air. This is a Saro London. All the Saunders Row planes were prefixed Saro, S-A-R-O for Saunders Row. And I'm sad I haven't got time to tell you about old man Saunders, who really was quite incredible. He had every kind of friend and associate. If you've heard of Uffa Fox, round about this time Uffa Fox was apprenticed at Saunders Row, and he went on to become famous and notorious and really rather fun. And King George V was on the throne, and Sam Saunders and King George V were great buddies. And I mustn't go off on another tangent or we won't get away from here till Saturday. The way that flight refueling worked was very simple. An extra fuel tank was built into the back of a flying boat, and actually they started off transferring water because they thought it might not work. Pity to waste a lot of fuel, so they were just transferring water to start with. This is an ordinary fireman's hose. If you go to any industrial complex, you'll see them to this day. Red steel drum with a red flexible hose, and they took the spray end off and they put one of those nozzles with a shut-off trigger, the same sort of nozzle that you use when you refuel your car at any garage. So that is what's called the tanker, and that is delivering the fuel. And here is the aeroplane. Here's the hose, and the delivery tanker's up here. And this character has an ordinary boat hook, and he catches onto this and pops it into there, presses the nozzle, and presto, the aeroplane is refueled. And that was great. That was David's great invention. He went on for a lot of other inventions, but none of them were within light years of this. But there were one or two small problems. You're all so young here. None of you would remember the traditional boat hook, which was about 15 feet, 5 meters long. It had a very heavy bronze hook on the end, and it weighed a ton, and it was naval standard, and we all used them. When I was apprenticed during the Second World War, if I went out to pick up a mooring gun, this is what I was wielding. And okay, I was a tough 17-year-old, so that was okay. But these were very, very serious pieces of kit. Every time you go to unless there was an electric car specialist, you've handled these things, you know how heavy they are. And the propellers were made of mahogany, hand carved and varnished with about literally 20 coats of varnish. If this nozzle touched that propeller, a piece might fly off and hit that propeller, and quite suddenly the engines would vibrate and the pilot would have to shut down both engines. And of course flying boats don't fly very far without the engines going. So it was a pretty dangerous business. Now, I wonder how many people remember Ron Hockey. He used to lecture on navigation. He was a group captain, retired. He lived in Gairloch Head. And these are Saunders Row Cloud aeroplanes. And in the 1930s, there was one afloat in Helensburgh. Ron was a brilliant pilot. He flew the two saboteurs to Czechoslovakia in 1943. This isn't my subject, but Czechoslovakia was run by a particularly unpleasant German Gauleiter, or whatever they're called, who nearly needed killing off. And Ron Hockey flew from Britain right across Europe in a specially adapted Wellington aircraft with extra fuel tanks on board, no bombs, no guns, and no crew apart from himself and the other pilot. And they parachuted these two characters over the capital city and turned around and flew back. And the saboteurs shot the German Gauleiter, but the repercussions were horrendous. But Ron Hockey, somebody should write a story about a biography. He went in for an air race in 1936, and it was from Manchester Airport, Ringway they called it in those days, don't know what they call it today, and it was round a lighthouse on the Isle of Man, and when Ron got to the Isle of Man there was thick fog, and he flew round the island lower and lower and lower because he had to circle around this lighthouse and then fly back. And eventually he saw the lighthouse up there, and when he landed he had the knickers of the lighthouse keeper's wife round his landing craft. He was that kind of pilot. And he is flying this flying boat. And the chap caught the hose end, but it was being pulled up because this plane was flying slightly too low and slightly too slow. So his mate grabbed him round the waist, and then both of them were being pulled out. And of course, none of that sissy nonsense like parachutes or anything like that. These characters were very tough. It's one reason why we won the Second World War. I think we had people like that. Fortunately, Ron realized that this plane was being pulled up at the stern, so it was pointing down. Things were getting worse, and so it increased the engine power, pulled the stick back, and up we went. And these two people flopped back into the aeroplane, and I'm sure they heaved a great sigh of relief. Nice not to be dropped from 20,000 feet, from about 6,000 feet. All these experiments had to be done in secret, so they were done out at sea over the English Channel very largely, although sometimes nearer home. Now, here's one of the problems they were up against. If you dropped the standard boat hook, it fell at what's called a terminal velocity of about 125 miles an hour. Above that speed, the wind resistance is greater than the pull of gravity. And the boat hook, if you're over the sea, plunged into the sea rather, well, at 125 miles an hour. If it plunged into the local cattle, of course, hopefully there was enough meat left that you could at least sell the rest of the cow. It was pretty dangerous, but that sort of thing went on quite a lot in those days, and of course nowadays we have rather swung the other way. Now there is a ship steaming down the Solent, and the mate on the bridge was actually looking, this is the starboard side of the bridge, he was looking to port, and something drew his attention behind him, and he turned around, and the boat hook had plunged into the sea, down and down and down, and then the buoyancy of the ash handle had overcome gravity, had overcome the resistance, the momentum, and the boat hook started to come upwards faster and faster and faster, and leapt out of the sea just as he looked around. And then, of course, it flopped down its side. But if it had been a little bit more that way, this chap would have been very dead indeed. So there were problems with flight refueling, even though it was a brilliant invention. Unfortunately, Saunders Roe wasn't making much money, and there wasn't money to develop the patent, and it was sold to a chap called Sir Alan Cobham, who set up a company after the Second World War called Flight Refueling, and then he changed the name to Cobham's, and he had a son who was also Sir Alan Cobham, and Cobham's has just been sold to the Americans. But the first Sir Alan had a very bright draftsman who invented this refueling trick, because by now, post-war, the slow aeroplanes were doing 300 miles an hour, and boat hooks are not on at 100 miles an hour. If you want to do an interesting experiment, find a friend with a car which has an opening roof. Stand in the footwell of the passenger seat with a 15-foot, 2-inch thick ash pole with a heavy bronze end. And there's a lovely bit of straight road past Fast Lane where you can practice waving this boat hook out of the window. And if there's a police car behind you, all you've got to do is drop the boat hook. That will sort the police car out. You've got to remember to blank off your number plates before you try this experiment. The nozzle has to be engaged on the probe, so this chap's got to fly rather well. But the air is turbulent because this is a bloody bit. It's actually a standard Boeing 747 or something with no passenger seats, just great big fuel tanks. And in fact, the best way to refuel is for one tanker to refuel one plane through the tail and one plane on each wing, so that you can refuel nowadays 3 fighters at once. But of course you've got to be quite good at flying. This is it's awful, isn't it? The Americans come into everything. They built 700 of these. Last time I looked, I should think probably they built 1,700 by now. And the probe into a modern, very modern fighter is no longer at the front. It comes up behind the pilot, and there's a man here, or a woman, who directs the drogue over the probe, and they refuel. In the early days, when the Brits were doing it, we couldn't produce tankers fast enough for the job, and the fighters had a minimum speed which was faster than the maximum speed of the tankers. So that was an interesting mathematical problem, and it was overcome by going very high up. Then this plane dives beyond its normal maximum speed. This plane gets in behind it, hooks onto the drogue, and in a steep dive they refuel. Well, fortunately, the pumps on the aircraft delivering the fuel are really powerful. I mean, a typical refueling is a very few minutes. So, before they actually hit the deck, the refueling was carried out by a tanker aircraft, which in theory could not refuel a modern fighter. So, the whole business of refueling is really quite exciting. The first war which I claim, perhaps rather arrogantly, that David won was the Falkland War, 1982. Now, here is Britain, here is the Sentinel Islands, which was the operational base for the Falkland War, and here is the Falklands. That distance is about 4,500 miles, and that distance is about 4,500 miles. The planes which went to Ascension Island could refuel in Spain, say, or in Africa, or both, and get to Ascension, no problem. And the fleet came from Portsmouth down to Ascension Island. Ascension Island is a volcanic rock. When we arrived in 1985, my wife, who was a very strong-minded lassie, got out of the plane and looked around, and there was no tree, there was no bush, there was no blade, no single blade of grass. There was nothing. And we were there for 15 days. And she said, this is going to be the most god-awful... Well, no, she didn't actually. She said, this is going to be a very bad holiday indeed. But fortunately, my cousin was the administrator there, and it turned out to be a brilliant holiday. But it is a very small place indeed. And Argentine is here, and Argentine was the enemy, and Argentine extends like that. So, how were we going to win the Falkland War when the answer really was flight refueling? When the ships took off, they had, from about here, aircraft patrolling overhead. Naval warships are great, and they cost a fortune, but they're incredibly vulnerable to air attack. And if you read the history of the Second World War, we kept damn near losing it because there were lots of German bombers or Japanese bombers around, and the Royal Navy kept losing a large number of very good ships from attack. So long before the Falkland War started, we knew that we had to have aeroplanes flying over the fleet. And we also needed to find out where the Argentinian submarines were and their fleet. So we had to fly in this area with reconnaissance aircraft, and the only way to do it was flight refueling based on Ascension Island. And it's rather nice to know that the Brits were light years ahead of the Americans insofar as flight refueling was concerned, which was nice because we did, well, the patent was in David's name, so we invented it. The Americans, of course, with so much money, they should build more and more flight refueling aircraft, which we couldn't afford. So we came up with a brilliant idea of having tankers which could refuel other tankers, which could refuel another tanker, which could refuel a bomber or a fighter. And that's one reason why we won the Falkland War. Oops, whoops. Let's go back again. Right, that is the refueling plan for the bombing of Stanley Airport. The black triangles are where the bomber was refueled, and the pink circles are where the refueling tankers were refueling each other. And if anybody's rude about the RAF, well, if you could pull that off, you're a better man or woman than me. I think it is the most incredible battle plan I've ever seen. The two planes took off, two bombers. This is typical of airplanes. One of them developed a fault and had to turn back, and that was the primary bomber for the target. So the lead bomber has to turn back. Why? Because these bombers have to fly very high, otherwise the engines are gulping fuel even faster. And if you fly high, you've got to have a pressurized fuselage. A little tiny access door in the side of the fuselage was not shut. So the assistant pilot tried to shut it. It's like somebody slamming a door. The door was about the size of my hand. And he slammed it, and he slammed it, and he tried again, and he couldn't get it airtight. So on that minute defect, the whole bombing expedition would have failed, except that the RAF knows how unreliable aeroplanes are, and they sent two. The first thing to do, of course, is make sure that all the heavy fuel which they used to take off and get up to altitude is replaced. So it's refueled pretty promptly. Then a refueling tanker refuels a refueling tanker, which refuels the bomber, which is refueled. No, let's get this right. So this refueling tanker refuels that one, which refuels the bomber, but they're coming in. You get the idea. It worked, although there were some pretty tense moments, and the bomber got here, dropped a whole stick of bombs across the runway of Stanley Airport, and though they didn't stop aeroplanes coming in, they stopped the heavy Argentinian planes coming in, and that made an enormous difference. And meanwhile, of course, reconnaissance airplanes were circling around here all the time, to make sure that there wasn't an Argentinian submarine coming in, and the fleet eventually, after this airfield was bombed, the fleet arrived here and was very vulnerable to air attacks. So they had to have standing air patrols, I think they're called, and these were done by Harrier aircraft, but of course they had a very short range, so aeroplanes from here, big air bombers and reconnaissance airmen, were flying all the way down with all this refueling, circling this area and then coming home. The bomber that dropped the bombs got to here, and it was running on fumes in the empty petrol, well, they're not petrol tanks, they're paraffin tanks, here, and that particular refueling was very fraught, and they landed back, and we didn't lose a single plane. So I think that is where David won his first war. Although, of course, he did get a bit of help from the parachutists and the Scots Guards and the Welsh Guards and the Marines and so on. The next war was the Cold War, and that is really fairly straightforward. Here is America, and here is the opposition, and here is Britain, and we are allied to this bunch. And the whole world is the battlefield. And the Americans had a particular problem. You cannot keep a secret in America, and they had bomber stations all over the place, but nobody would keep their mouth shut. And of course all the world knew, and I mean all the world knew, where exactly the American nuclear bombers were lodged. And the only answer to that, to prevent a preemptive strike from Russia using flight refueling and bombing these planes on the ground, was to put the planes up in the air and refuel them. And the planes flew typically 24 hours, obviously the 3 or 4 pilots, and they'd get a little bit of sleep, and then they would patrol. Well, they wouldn't go obviously over the country borderline, but they fly all around here within bombing range of Moscow. And if the Russians had dropped the first bomb, the Americans would have plastered Moscow and Vladivostok within a very few hours. And we actually kept our nuclear bombers up in Scotland, and they had a number of very cunning plans for getting to Moscow, like flying below hill height in a plane. The planes were originally designed to fly very high, but they were modified to fly very low indeed. And if you've ever watched the bombing, the Dam Busters film, you will get an idea of what flying very low is. So, this is, and though you wouldn't know it today, we won the Cold War, though it started all over again as far as I can make out. You might think that flight refueling is dangerous, and I think you're wrong. I think it was exceedingly dangerous. And the Americans had a refueling event on the south coast of Spain, and the tanker was hit by the plane being refueled, and they both crashed. The crews got out, but the 4 nuclear bombs in the bomber were discharged before the plane hit the sea. Since I did this drawing, I've discovered that in fact 3 nuclear bombs landed in this area and 1 in the sea, and they've discovered where they all are. The one I know about most landed in a field in Spain where they grow tomatoes, which are sold in British supermarkets. So next time you go shopping, if you're going for the tomatoes, take the Geiger counter with you. So I think that David won 2 wars, although perhaps that is a little bit of an exaggeration, but he was my father, so I'm biased. 40, And in these days, what we now call Ministry of Defence Navy was called the Admiralty, and communication was by letter. And the post office these days, of course, is just such a shadow of former self. If you posted a letter anywhere in Britain in 1940, in the middle of the war, it arrived next day without fail, and none of this nonsense of first and second class mail. And the letter cost 1.5 old pence, which is 240th of a pound. So the post office is overcharging you and undelivering, and it's a record. So my father's in hospital in the spring of 1940, and a letter arrives in the hospital. Dear Captain Nicholson, would you assist in a operation about which we can't tell you until you get to the city of Bath, but here are extra petrol rations, because petrol is rationing, of course, extra petrol coupon rationings, and if your wife could drive you to the city of Bath, you will be told everything there. So my father discharges himself from the hospital, and my mother drives him to Bath, and he's given a desk and a telephone, and he's not told why, but he's told to assemble motorboats from all the yacht yards. And of course, he, being in the industry, he knew all the yacht yards, and he had friends who ran them and mates who were foremen in them. In those days, the boat industry was quite tiny. We didn't import all our boats from continents, so they were rather better built. And my father's given a desk and a telephone and told to get all the motorboats from all around the coast to Dover. And that was the beginning of Dunkirk rescue. So he did more than invent flight refueling. Right, I really taken up too much of your time.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you again.
Here's your gadget.
Just wait a second. I thought you could maybe do with some refueling.
Oh, miss, thank you.
So there, you can
Thank you very much.
refuel
Thank you.
the tank in your plane, you know.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was fascinating. And as I say, thanks again, Ian. And we'll need to have many more talks for the next few years. And thanks again for everybody turning out tonight. It's great. This is the first time for 2 years we've really been able to have a meeting face to face. And who knows, we might follow England next month and not even need any masks. So we're going to continue. We've got 2 weeks' time. We've got a talk at Purdue and the Atalaya evening. There'll be fairly limited numbers. There's not a lot of space there. And then next month, I think it's the 9th, we've got Bob Shelton coming for a talk, and then 2 weeks after that we've got a kind of AGM sort of thing. Stuart McDonald's coming. He was originally coming last month, but he's postponed till then. So it'll be nice to see you all back, and the more the merrier. Okay, thanks very much for coming, and thanks Ian again.
Thank you.
So where's the skiing going on?